Welcome to the Boom Clap podcast, where culture and conviction collide. I'm Rita Rogers.
And I'm Cecily Dickey.
We've got a great episode for you today. We've got Will Estrada from HSLDA on with us. He is the senior legal counsel for the HSLDA. We're going to talk about homeschooling and some of the, I don't want to say legislation that's coming, because these things aren't already being legislated on, but there is potential for laws coming and increased regulation with homeschooling. We've seen a lot of articles published. I know the Washington Post has had articles that I've said, oh, they are stirring the pot. They are stirring the pot with homeschooling. There was an article in our local paper this last August, and he actually talked about the ProPublica article, which is linked to what was put out in our local paper. So I think there are some things potentially coming down the pike that homeschoolers need to be really aware of. He talks about that. And then he gets into the history of homeschooling a lot, which I didn't intend upon, and just philosophical beliefs of whose responsibility is the child.
Yeah.
And overall, just a really wonderful, enlightening conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you're listening to this and you're not a homeschooler and you're wondering, I wonder if this is going to apply to me or not, it absolutely will, because as he says in the episode, the question boils down to, yes, to whom do children belong, but also what's the role of government and what is more important, the family or the government? What came first? What's more important? So very interesting conversation. He's really great to listen to, and he's had a really interesting career. So I'm actually tempted to get him on again someday, just to talk about some of the more things he did, some of the other things he did, because he's seen a lot and done a lot.
Yeah, I actually wish that I would have asked him a little bit more about his mother and her quitting that major career in order to homeschool them. So that would be great to have him on potentially again.
Yeah. And I realized later, I thought his mom was a homeschooler, but I misunderstood. His wife was homeschooled, not his mom.
Yeah.
So anyway, when you hear me make that mistake in the episode later, guys, I realized it right away. It happens. So.
Yeah. Well, this is our first time recording again in the new year. You guys have had 4 episodes now, 5 episodes maybe with us. We had
6.
Yeah. Last week, it was just us again. We spoke with Ashley Lande 2 weeks ago about her experience using psychedelics and then coming to Christ. And that episode, psychedelics is something, I know I'll say this in the episode, but it's something I never thought I would be talking about, but I broached the subject with my Instagram audience, and it turned into this whole thing, and I made a highlight, and it just snowballed into this conversation that I think is really important. I think it's something that we need to be discussing, because by my messages, it has touched a lot more people than you know. And if you have conversations with people about it, you're going to realize it as well. So anyway, make sure you're listening next week and you go back and listen to those episodes you might have missed if you haven't gotten to those yet. And please leave us a review. If you haven't yet, or if it's been a long time, you can leave us a new review. Go to Apple or Spotify, click the 5-star, and you can leave us a written review also. We love getting DMs from you, and when you send us a kind DM about what you appreciate about the episode, just copy paste that into a review. It helps propel our podcast to new listeners. While I believe the doctor's office can have its time and place, I am so thankful for the ways that I have learned to take care of my family's health at home, and for the tools that I have in my toolbox, as I call it, to help care for my family when they're sick. One of those tools that I've put in my family's toolbox is homeopathy. And one of the brands that we trust is Remedy Collective. We have their first aid kit, which has a guide with a list of problems that I can go to decide what remedy I want to use. And the first aid kit has a bunch of remedies that cover almost all of the problems that we will encounter. It's been so helpful for our family to have. If you're interested in learning more about homeopathy and possibly getting a first aid kit for you and your family, go to remedycollective.com/boomclappodcast and use the code boomclap to save 10% on your order. All right. Hi, Will. We are so happy to have you on with us today from HSLDA. I heard you speak just recently through an ICHE, like kind of a conference call they had regarding some laws potentially coming down the pike for homeschooling. And it was so good. I was like, this is who we need to reach out to talk about some of the things that are, like I said, just coming down the pike with homeschooling. So can you tell us who you are, what you do?
Absolutely, Rita. Well, first off, it's a privilege to be on with you and Cecily and talking to homeschoolers. I thought it was just in the United States, but I find out we've got homeschoolers in Canada and probably different countries as well. So it is a privilege to be on with you. I'm a homeschool graduate myself from Pennsylvania. My parents homeschooled myself and my 7 siblings. So there were 8 of us growing up in a mountain and double wide. Dad was a public school teacher. Mom gave up her job working on the precursor of the internet, actually, at IBM, to stay home and to homeschool all 8 of us kids. So did that. I have great respect for both of you, Rita and Cecily, homeschool moms and podcasters. You're kind of doing it all. I'm in awe. And then my wife and I homeschool our 2 kids as well. So we live in Loudoun County, Virginia. So you may have seen some of our school board meetings on the news. And so it was a very easy decision that we're not even going to consider the public schools and homeschool our kids. They're 12 and 7, 2 boys, and they're thriving in homeschooling. So it's a privilege to be on with you. Thank you for what you're doing. A little bit about, that's pretty much about me. I went to law school. I've been at Homeschool Legal Defense, started in January of 2004. So 21 years ago, took a few years off, was in the federal government working at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in the Office for Civil Rights. Then I ran a small nationwide nonprofit called Parental Rights Foundation, working on parental rights issues more broadly. And then really my passion has always been homeschooling. And so a year and a half ago, I came back to Homeschool Legal Defense. I'm so glad they took me back, and no plans to ever leave again. So I'm senior counsel here at Homeschool Legal Defense. I handle 10 states for HSLDA. And in one of those states is Illinois as well, which is why, Rita, as you were saying, you heard me in that talk. So Homeschool Legal Defense was founded in 1983. And back in the 80s, homeschooling was illegal in many of the 50 states. Parents faced jail time or child protective service investigations. And today, by the grace of God and hardworking parents and state organizations and the work of HSLDA, homeschooling is not just legal in all 50 states, but it's mainstream. And it's legal in a lot of the world as well. Cecily, as you know, it's legal in Canada. It's legal in many European countries. In fact, the countries where homeschooling is illegal, those are the outliers: Germany, Sweden, and a couple others. So it's a privilege to serve homeschoolers as part of Homeschool Legal Defense. We've been around now for 41 years. We fight to defend homeschool freedom in the courts, in the legislatures, in the court of public opinion. And I love what I get to do serving homeschool families.
Okay.
Well, yeah. And we're thankful for it because of countries like Germany and Sweden, where you hear these stories and of families literally leaving the country because they want the freedom to educate their kids at home. So if it was not for people like you, I don't know that our countries would be free to home educate their kids. And something that I find really interesting, Rita, you probably picked up on this too, is that your mom was a public school teacher, and almost every single homeschooler we've talked to on this podcast, including my husband, is a public school teacher, but every single public school or person who homeschools that we've talked to on this podcast, I think they were teachers first. And so I just think that's a really interesting correlation, and very interesting that, I mean, you were homeschooled years ago and your mom also. So very interesting.
I think it's because there's a sense that you can't really homeschool. It's too hard. You need to be a teacher. But when you have kids, you sort of realize, whether or not your kids are in a public school or a private school, or even before you're beginning schooling, you are your child's first teacher. You're teaching them to do the ABCs. You're potty training them. You're reading books with them. And so a lot of parents who end up homeschooling, and my wife, and she's a homeschool graduate herself, but she was like this as well. She was like, wait a minute, I'm already doing this. Let's just see how kindergarten goes. And then let's see how first grade goes and second grade goes. And then you're like, wait a minute, I can do this. I don't need to outsource the education of my children. And, the pandemic really showed a lot of parents, wait a minute, I can do this. And I think that's why we've seen such significant growth of homeschooling post-pandemic.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think that is where I saw some of these, some of the signs that there's going to probably be some things coming down on homeschooling parents, some laws coming and things we need to watch out for, because there were articles coming out. Just in my local paper, there was an article last August, and I was just looking through my phone before I came on because I was like, I know I took a picture of this, but it was centered around kind of what we're going to talk about. It was about safety in the home and laws that need to be enacted to keep kids safe. But I think what has happened potentially is there was this mass exodus from the public school system during COVID. The schools were getting all of these COVID dollars from the federal government and state. And now those COVID dollars are ending and they're seeing that their enrollment is down and they've got to do something to try to make homeschooling a little bit harder to get these kids back in school. I think that's one of the things potentially happening. I don't know. That's speculation, but
I think it absolutely is. It depends on the state, but we have seen in some states where there's been significant growth in homeschooling, and so a subsequent drop in the enrollments in the public schools. It seems like those public schools are more aggressive in harassing homeschoolers. And the weird thing is they can't stop you from homeschooling. I've actually had I handle California for Homeschool Legal Defense as well. I had a principal once tell me, nope, this parent cannot homeschool her child. It was a immigrant from Mexico. And I said, well, the U.S. Supreme Court disagreed with you, so we'll court. And she immediately kind of backed down and said, oh, okay. And, the district ran up the white flag. But they can't stop you from homeschooling. And so it's like, why are you even trying to harass homeschool families? Let them do what they want. And, honestly, if the public schools did a better job, I think you would have less people even considering homeschool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So what percent, this isn't a question I thought of ahead of time, but maybe not even what percent is the good question, but how many homeschooling families do you think are in need of legal defense at some point during their homeschooling process? Because it seems you guys have no shortage of things to help people with.
That's a great question, Rita, and it really depends on the state. So when Homeschool Legal Defense was founded back in 1983, pretty much 100% of families needed some type of legal defense or legal guidance. By the 90s, that had really decreased. There was a family where the parents were thrown in jail for the night in Texas as late as 1994. So wow. 30 years ago, there was still a homeschool family where the parents went to jail. That was the Leeper decision, and it ended up going to the Texas Supreme Court, and homeschooling was legalized as part of that. But Michigan as well, also in 1994, parents were still facing jail time. So by the 90s, it was less families were needing legal defense, but something that we were seeing in the 90s was homeschooling was being accepted, but Child Protective Services, for example, was instituting investigations when parents were pulled out of public school. No evidence of abuse and neglect, but this kind of thought of, if you're homeschooling, you may be neglecting your children. That's a trigger for Child Protective Services to be involved. And so HSLDA kind of built out this niche area in the law of, we're also experts in Fourth Amendment law, of course, the right of parents to be secure and families to be secure and their persons, houses, papers in effect. The government cannot come into your home. It's not just, a cop with a gun and a badge, but a social worker. They are an investigator. They're an employee of the local or state government. And so the Fourth Amendment applies to them as well. They can't just come into your home. And so we've done a lot of Child Protective Service investigations, law and cases. I've probably handled around 1,000 of those cases. Wow. And then as the 2000s came, it really began to decrease. So the cases that we see now of where families are told you can't homeschool, they're very infrequent. But there are many states where families have a lot of interaction with the government. And one example would be Pennsylvania. There's kind of a vagueness in the law of, do you need to provide immunization and medical and dental records to the local school district? And because the law is vague, some of the 500 school districts in Pennsylvania will threaten families with truancy actions if the families will not send sensitive medical information to the local public school. And so we've been helping families there. It's been a a lot of fighting in Pennsylvania. A lot of families have needed legal advice. None of those cases have actually gone to court. The school districts have all backed down, but it really depends on the state. Some states, it's still upwards of 60-70% of families who are homeschooling are going to have an interaction with the government, and we need to get involved. Other states, it's significantly less. The other thing we do, though, and this probably segues into the conversation we're going to be talking about, is the battles in the legislature, at least in the 50 states, with the exception of Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. Most of the states, homeschooling is very, very free, and there's very little regulation. And we want to keep it that way. So we do a lot of work actually this time of year as the state legislatures in all 50 states are opening up. We're testifying before committees and before legislatures. We're reviewing hundreds, sometimes thousands of bills. And so we want to make sure we don't go backwards in the case of homeschool freedom.
I was struck by the 60 to 70% in some states need help. Wow. And I'm in Illinois, and I feel like almost talking quiet when I say this because Illinois traditionally is a high regulation state. But when it comes to homeschooling, there's not really anything. And
Illinois is, and sometimes people think it's just the red states that are good for homeschooling. I mean, Illinois is a solid blue state, and you have one of the best laws regarding homeschooling. And the interesting thing is it's not a law at all. It comes from the 1950 landmark case, People versus Levison. And that was where the Illinois Supreme Court overturned a truancy action against a family who was homeschooling their kids and said, nope. It doesn't matter how large a private school is. The way the private school statute is written, it can include one family educating their children in a one-family school in their home, which is a 1950s way of saying homeschooling.
Homeschool. Yeah, I'm learning so much from you. I'm like, this is a great conversation. I'm so excited about this. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, but it's so interesting because so I didn't start off homeschooling my kids. They went to a small private Christian school, kind of a Montessori type school. I was a nurse. It worked out perfectly. But then I am not working anymore because of the COVID situation. And I've always kind of wanted to homeschool my kids. So let's try it. This is a perfect time to try. But when I pulled my kids out, I actually had someone in my life who was like, so what do you have to do? She was just kind of inquiring and nothing. And she's like, what do you mean nothing? And I'm like, nothing. You don't have to tell anyone that you're homeschooling. You don't have to, do you have to provide records to anyone? Do you have to tell them what you're teaching? I'm like, no. And I just found it so interesting because this is somebody who is very much, would consider themselves a conservative, is very highly questioning of the government, knows that there are inefficiencies in government, but it's we are so accustomed to government oversight and regulation that even the people that verbalize some disdain for the government want it or find a problem with not having that regulation. And so when we're going to talk about the what is it called?
Make Homeschool Safe Act.
Yes, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education and the Make Homeschool Safe Act. It's I can see if people got to dig in with you, that they would understand the problems with it. But I think surface level, even a lot of people who could see problems with it may be okay with it when they just hear about it, So I think this conversation that we're getting into is going to be really important for all people to hear, even if they, just that's all I'm going to say right now. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And really, Rita, what you're talking about, and I think, Rita and Cecily, why your podcast resonates with so many people is that it really comes down to, it's not schooling. It's what is the purpose of government? And what is more important, the family or the government? And, not to get too philosophical on all of us, but I'm kind of a nerd. I've been to a Star Trek convention. I've met William Shatner. So, I'm a nerd. I recently, this is the nerdiest thing a lawyer can do too, but it's the coolest thing a lawyer can do. It's to write a law review article. So I recently wrote a law review article it was, I like to write, I like to read, and I love history. That was my, when I was being homeschooled, people would say, what's your favorite subject? I was like, reading history, because I love to read that. And so it was published in Liberty University Law Review. It's titled Homeschooling in the United States, A Seismic Parental Rights Victory. It was published spring 2024. So you can just Google it, it'll pop up. But what I did was, I wanted to talk about homeschooling, but I went right back to the beginning and I said, where do parental rights come from? And so I went through parental rights in the context of actually started with the Jewish faith traditions, then the Christian faith traditions, and then the Muslim faith traditions. And the very interesting thing is, in all three of the great Abrahamic world religions, they all agree that God created the family, and the family came first. And I went through, rabbinical writings and different law reviews and medical journals. There was a fascinating medical journal published by the University of Tehran regarding the family and parental rights and children's rights in the context of Islam. Went back and looked at, the great 17th century Protestant theologian Matthew Henry and what he said about the family. And when you really understand of as a Christian, what I believe is that God created the family. The family comes first. This is kind of the wonky term is pre-political, that the family predates government. And the interesting thing is Aristotle, the Greek philosophers all said the same thing. They weren't monotheistic. They were polytheistic. You think of Greece, but they went back and looked at the animal kingdom and said, no, the family comes first. But even with all of that, we saw the rumblings in the beginning of history. Plato, he writes in the Republic his ideal government, and he said we should have these guardians of the Republic, and all the kids should be in common, the wives should be in common, the family should be in common, children with disabilities should be left to die in a cave because they're not really going to be beneficial to the state. And that was the first time, at least in what I would say is significant history, you had someone significant who had a very, very, I would call it a dystopian view of the family and the state. The interesting thing is Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, disagreed with Plato. And you go through the rest of history, the English common law philosophers, the founding of our country, everyone went back to that Judeo-Christian heritage of the family comes first, they are most important. And really until the early 1900s, industrialization, World War I, that we really began to see the attack against parental rights. So when we talk about the Make Homeschool Safe Act and Coalition for Responsible Home Education and those media stories that you've seen in Illinois in particular, Rita, it's not something new. It really goes back to philosophically, who's in charge, the parents or the government?
Yeah.
100%.
That's a great question. And I wrote it down because I want to remember to put that in our show notes when we publish this episode, because that is the question that we need to consider, not just with home education, but that question bleeds into literally everything else in life, right? And so the Make Homeschool Safe Act, just the title of that, it implies that homeschool is not safe. Like the assumption is that homeschool is not safe. Therefore, we need to make it safe. And just going through some of the bullets on the front page there, homeschooled children deserve to be safe at home. Homeschooled children deserve to be accounted for. Homeschooled children deserve to get a quality education. Homeschooled children deserve to have their academic progress assessed. Homeschooled children deserve to have qualified teachers. Homeschooled children deserve to have records and identification. Homeschooled children deserve to have access to school resources and activities. Homeschooled children deserve to get support for their disabilities. Homeschooled children deserve to access medical care. So some of those things I find faulty, first of all, like qualified teachers. For example, we talked about that already. What does it mean to be a qualified teacher? Like state certified, is that what makes you qualified? But some of these things, like homeschooled children deserve to be safe at home. Yes, of course they do, just like every single other child does. But we're not saying, make public school safe, because we know that some of these kids face abuse in their own homes and at school. So it's just a dangerous assumption. Words are so powerful. And so I find it very interesting, and I'm sure it was very intentional, the titling of this. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, Cecily, you're so right about that. And before we talk about the Make Homeschool Safe Act, I want to kind of set the stage and explain who the Coalition for Responsible Home Education is.
Mhm.
So first off, the good news is the Make Homeschool Safe Act. It's a 23-page model bill. It has not yet been introduced in any one of the 50 states. It's more kind of U.S. focused. I don't think there's been any talk about it in the Parliament in Canada or in any of the Canadian provinces. So it's primarily focused here in the United States. And the reason is the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. They were founded in 2013, and every single one of their founders and staff are homeschool graduates. So I always want to say at the outset, I have no ill will towards any of the people who were involved in this. I knew many of them growing up, actually. I was involved in homeschool high school debate and debated several of these people
Interesting.
who later, while they were being homeschooled, they loved being homeschooled. And then later on, some of them had crises of faith, the deconstruction term. Others had bad homeschool upbringings. Others had great homeschool upbringings, but they were sympathetic to friends who didn't. And so I think at least for some of the people who were involved, it's very well intentioned. And because they are all homeschool graduates, when they go testify in legislatures or when they talk to the media, they kind of have the same effect that I do as a homeschool graduate, or Cecily and Rita, you do as homeschool parents. People will say, oh, you're someone in that community. We want to listen to you. And the kind of not so good thing, however, is the Make Homeschool Safe Act. Cecily, you're 100% correct. It is very intentional how they framed it. And Coalition for Responsible Home Education has not always been like that. 2 years ago, they published an internal style guide, which was geared for their allies in the legislature, their allies in the media. We got a copy of it. And it's exceedingly hostile towards homeschooling, towards parental rights, towards people of faith. It is just the language that it uses is very disrespectful towards families, and they've since seen, okay, that hasn't been very effective in our lobbying. We're now going to say, oh, we're friends of homeschooling, and we're going to try and make homeschool safe. So the old saying, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. Unfortunately, they showed their true colors 2 years ago in that style guide. It's something I have a copy of. We haven't publicized it because I'm not out to not out for war or anything, but it's important when we think of who are these people and what are they pushing. And then when you dig into the Make Homeschool Safe Act, Cecily, I'm glad you went through some of those bullet points. It really starts at a premise of who's going to be making these decisions. Sometimes Coalition for Responsible Home Education and their allies will say, oh, this is about protecting children and children's rights. But a 9-year-old is not ready to make these decisions. And that would be, even medical decisions, immunizations, schooling. And so families are there or the government is there. And so who is going to be making these decisions for an immature 9-year-old? Loving parents who have raised that child, or some government bureaucrat? The Coalition for Responsible Home Education thinks that, as Ronald Reagan said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. But Ronald Reagan said the 10 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. I've been on the inside of the federal bureaucracy in health and human services. There are a lot of well-intentioned people, but I can guarantee none of them loves their children or loves your children like you do, Rita, and like you do, Cecily, and like our listeners do, because you as a parent you'll lay down your life for your child, and a government bureaucrat is not going to do that. So that's for starters. When we think of this 23-page model bill, we come at it from very deeply philosophical differences. And so everything that flows out from that bill is going to come from those differences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, I think potentially, I don't want to say you're being charitable because you know these people and you grew up with them and things, but I look at it and I'm like, I see the parental rights extremism page. And I'm like, I think if you read between the lines, you don't even have to read between the lines very deep. And you can see that a lot of this boils down to missed opportunities to be taught the kind of woke education. A lot of this is the LGBTQ plus thing.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes.
I kind of dug
several
into
several of their staff are transgender, and I think I think some of it is rooted in disagreements with their parents or even their upbringing and their gender identity. I think
that's what I'm seeing is there's a lot of just like, I'm mad because I was raised a girl and I think I'm a boy. And so I think every child should have the opportunity to explore whatever gender they want. And because the parents in homeschool realms, there's a lot of Christian upbringing, I'm mad about that. And I want that to be dismantled. That's what I'm seeing when I read between the lines of the safe. I feel like everything right now, there's every bill that goes through at the national level, there's the title and what they say they want to do. And there's the actual meat of the bill, that's something completely different. It's almost like an opposites game. If it says it's going to like save you money, it's going to cost you a lot of money or vice versa, So
I think Orwell had a phrase for that, the double speak.
Yes, exactly. That's a much more concise way of stating it.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of this. The first one is the Make Homeschool Safe Act. And again, it's a model bill. They're shopping it to legislators. It has not been introduced in any state yet, although Illinois is actually one of the states we're pretty concerned about based on some of the news stories. ProPublica did a big hit piece on homeschooling in Illinois last year. We had several high-powered legislators in Springfield, the capital of Illinois, call for it. And, so far, nothing has been introduced in the Illinois legislature, but we're very engaged on this. We have a lot of homeschoolers who are, or in any other state as well, but we're on high alert for this. The first thing it would do is it would give the school district superintendent vast powers to supervise, approve, or even deny a family's decision to homeschool. In 49 of the 50 states today, of the U.S. states, homeschooling is a notice state, not an approval. So you notify the school district you're going to be homeschooling, and then so long as you're following the law and homeschooling, regardless, some states have more details in the law, others like Illinois have less, but so long as you're educating your children, and if you are having to turn in information, then there's really nothing the district can do. Massachusetts is an approval state. You actually cannot homeschool unless you are approved by your school district. Wow. And I've personally helped families where they've undergone child protective service investigations. I had one family where they had a founded report of neglect simply because they withdrew their child and began homeschooling before getting approval from the superintendent. Wow. Now the family ended up moving out of Massachusetts. Yeah. They didn't work with children. So like a teacher, for example, that could have been the end of their career with that finding. So it ended up not being a major issue for that family, but it just was a sobering reminder of many of these school district superintendents. My dad was a public school teacher. Many teachers are, I think, Cecily, you said your husband is a teacher. There are many dedicated, hardworking men and women who are teachers and in public school administrative roles, and I have a lot of respect for them. But there are some who abuse their power. And I talk daily with families where they've been getting the runaround with a child with special needs. Their IEP or their 504 plan is not being followed by the school district. And finally, they say, we've had it. We're going to homeschool. And those are the school districts where their children are not being treated well. And I'm like, do we want to give these superintendents the power to deny a family's homeschool program? That's the first thing that the Make Homeschool Safe Act would do. It would provide significant powers that in 49 of the 50 states, school districts really don't have that power to deny a homeschool program. Another thing, and as a civil liberties attorney, it just drives me up a wall. There is a provision in the Make Homeschool Safe Act that if a family has even been investigated by Child Protective Services, so no finding, they could have been cleared, it could have been an anonymous tip from a grumpy neighbor or a disgruntled relative or even an ex-spouse or someone like that. But if the family has even been investigated by Child Protective Services over a 3-year time frame, then the family cannot homeschool. And that violates due process. That violates our constitutional protections in the United States of innocent until proven guilty. And I think it really just kind of underscores that this bill was not thought out well. It's not recognizing the constitutional protections. 1925, 100 years ago, the United States Supreme Court said in the case of Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the child is not the mere creature of the state. The courts have recognized for 100 years that parents make these decisions, that the child is not the creature of the state. The Make Homeschool Safe Act, at least in the context of homeschooling, would, I think, reverse that and violates the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's another very troubling issue that I think violates due process and innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And then kind of a third thing I'll address, and then, sorry, I've been monopolizing, so I'll turn it back to you. There's a provision in the bill near the end, I think it's on page 20, that says that families have to provide immunization, medical records to the school district. And if they don't, that could be a medical neglect issue. And in Pennsylvania, where, as I said, we're seeing 60, 70% of families having contact with the school district because of the vagueness in the law, this would just open the door to basically the school districts being the immunization police on families. And it would not be something that would be used well by the school districts. It would be an avenue for districts to basically harass families, for the government to get more information on families. So, regardless of what you think about immunizations, and I think this is a very important issue that families should think about very carefully. They should talk to their health provider. They should do their research on it. But as we saw during COVID, I don't want to have, public school officials be the ones making these decisions for families. And that's another thing the Make Homeschool Safe Act would do if it were to become law in the state.
Yeah. Yes. All of those 3 points you brought up are troubling, all of them. And the immunization one is the red flag that I know our listeners are going to be like, oh my gosh. But the second one, the investigation and child protective services, I think that one is so troubling from the standpoint of it could almost eliminate homeschooling if you have someone in the community that's against homeschooling, because all they have to do is call child protective services on a few families that they don't want to see homeschooling anymore, open an investigation, and you're done.
Yeah.
It
could be something as simple as values, right? Like when we were talking about the fact that there is wonderful teachers and administrators and all of that. But that being said, there's a lot of them that have been fully taken over by the ideology of DEI. And so I read a lot of communication from superintendents or administrators, school boards, and what I see is that they're speaking English. So, everyone can understand what they're saying, but it's almost like there's this different dialect and it's this DEI dialect, and it's you either know it or you don't. And so you think you understand what they're saying, but if you don't actually speak DEI, then you don't. So it comes down to values, right? And like, if there's someone in the community who's super against homeschooling, and like a lot of these people from the CRHE, I think I'm getting that right?
Yes, yeah. CRHE, okay. Coalition for Responsible Home Education.
Yes, and they have their ideology. And if they chose to, like I'm from a small town, and you started kind of going after all the homeschoolers and reporting, and not because they're bad people. Like I really want to make that clear. It's just they have such a different idea of what government involvement should be. They have their own set of values, and they think everyone else should do that. And if they're not, then they're obviously neglecting and abusing. And it's tricky, right? And the question that comes to my mind is, so there's many people who want stricter regulation. There's many people who don't want any regulation. But then there's people who are just plain confused about it, who don't homeschool themselves and think, well, if there's not regulation, are you just wanting anarchy? Like, how is anyone supposed to monitor anything? So how do you explain to people? I don't know. I don't even know how to phrase my question exactly, but for people that don't understand, they might just think we just want anarchy. We don't want any control. We don't want any oversight. And how's anyone going to know that any kids are safe that are homeschooled?
We're in the heart of winter, and everyone's looking for different ways to support their immune system. RoCasaOrganics.com has many items that fit the bill, And you can use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% on your order. One of the first items on your list when you go to rocasaorganics.com should be their elderberry syrup. They have over 1,000 5-star reviews, and in one weekend last year, they sold over 7,000 bottles. There's a reason it's a hot-selling item. It works. They have many other items for your immune system needs. Go to rocasaorganics.com and use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% on your first order.
Yeah, Cecily, that's a great question. There's kind of several ways to answer it. I think the first one I would say is all 50 states, and this is a great rejoinder when you talk to people, especially if you're in a state like New Jersey or New Jersey or Illinois or Texas, where there's really no reporting that homeschoolers do to the school. Like Rita, I'm thinking about your friend who's conservative, who was like, "What? You don't have to do anything or give any information." All 50 states still have education neglect laws, and all 50 states have truancy laws, compulsory attendance laws. And so if you're not doing anything, if you're not educating your kids, if they're sitting at home and watching SpongeBob, which, spoiler, I think that's the stupidest TV show ever made. If your kids are just sitting at home watching SpongeBob, you're going to get prosecuted, whether you live in Texas or New Jersey or Illinois, states that don't have strict homeschool laws. You can't educationally neglect your child.
So I do have a question about that, though, and I don't mean to cut you off midstream because I want to hear where you're going with that. But while I agree that would be absolutely awful and it shouldn't be happening, how do they know it's happening? Like, how are you going to be prosecuted? Like, how do they know that you should be prosecuted for letting your kid watch SpongeBob all day rather than providing them with
education? Cecily, it comes down to that key word you said, prosecuted. These are criminal statutes. And so the government would have the burden of proving it. It would be difficult for them to prove it. But if a relative is saying, look, there's a 14-year-old who doesn't know his ABCs sort of thing, and there's no special needs going on, then people would find out. If kids are the rejoinder I always get of, the kid's locked in the basement sort of thing, neighbors are going to see that. We love our kids. Cecily or Rita, if you saw something weird going on, you would, of course, because you're not busybodies, you would go and talk to the parent. But if they were like, yep, our kids just watch SpongeBob, or we don't care about them, or you saw something was off, you would, as people who want to make sure that children are protected, you would do something. And so these are criminal laws where, again, the government is the burden of proof, again, innocent till proven guilty, due process, but they are strong protections to make sure that children are not being abused, that education is happening. So, to that question, it's a great question, Cecily, of how do we respond to that? The first one is there are laws in place. We don't need additional laws like Make Homeschool Safe Act. But the second one is what we've already talked about. It goes down to a philosophy of, to whom do children belong? Who loves a child more? Is it going to be a government bureaucrat, even a well-intentioned government bureaucrat, or is it going to be a parent? And then the final thing, and I think this is a difficult concept for where we are today, but it kind of also starts philosophically. And our founders recognize this, that man is inherently sinful. Human beings are inherently sinful. And so as a result, you need a government. I'm not a libertarian. That I might have some listeners who who disagree with me, but I'm not a libertarian because in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, we see what happens in a kind of libertarian society, and that's the final chapter of Judges. The final chapters of Judges are a very disturbing chapter and it ends with the last words of the book of Judges are, and there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so anarchy. Exactly. And as a result, our founders recognized this, and they said, we do need to have a government. This is Romans 13 in the Christian scriptures. You have a government to punish evildoers, but we don't punish people in advance. We could probably create a system where no one was ever harmed. There was never any murder. There was never any abuse. If the government was coming into everyone's homes, we probably could have a system of where newspapers would never publish something that was damaging if every newspaper had to submit their newspaper to a government agent for review prior to publication. That's called prior restraint. But we as a country have not done that. We have strict laws, and we should have strict laws. And sometimes, it seems like we're not punishing evildoers as much as we should, but we have laws to punish people who break the laws. But we as a country have said we are not going to have a police state where everyone first gets permission from the government, whether to publish something, pen is mightier than the sword, or whether to raise their children. And Cecily, it's interesting, you being from Canada, because this is a distinctly American system of government. Most of the world has adopted, there are two treaties in particular, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Both of these UN treaties say the best interest of the child is paramount. The United Kingdom, Scotland, for example, when they adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, they went so far, they passed a law about 10 years ago. It was called the Named Persons Act, which said to protect children, we are going to assign to every child at birth a government social worker who's going to basically come into the home at set stages and make sure that the child is being raised well. That is taken to its extreme, the philosophy that we have with Coalition for Responsible Home Education and the Make Homeschool Safe Act. Now, the good news is Scotland's law was so extreme that the UK High Court said, no, this violates parental rights and struck it down. But the United States is the only country in the world that has not adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so we have this philosophy of, no, we're not going to put best interests of the child over parental and family rights. And, some people, it's a hard concept. They're like, well, if we can save even one child. And I always push back gently and say, at what expense of having the government basically trample families, of have children see that their parents can't be trusted? It would tear apart families and homes. But it, again, goes to that philosophy. And it used to be it was the United States and Somalia that were the only two countries in the world that had not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I believe Somalia actually has gone ahead, their government, and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the United States is the sole country on earth that has not ratified it. And it sends I think, a very important message of, no, we're not going to trample parental rights.
Yeah. Well, like you said, we could have the government coming in the home. We could have the government looking at the news before it's printed. And historically, the governments who do come in the home and look at the news before it's printed do end up becoming the evildoer, the government itself. So, yeah, you're not going to eliminate evil, period. That's just not possible.
And that's the philosophical difference. And it's it's a distinctly monotheistic view of, yes, there is a loving God, and yes, humans are flawed and we need government to enforce them. And so as we've seen a rise, I think in, Pew Research calls it the nuns, of people who have no religious affiliation. And I'm not just talking about Christian, we serve many Jewish families, many Muslim families, and many Hindu families and Christian families as well. But we're seeing more, as I think we're having secularism replace religion, and that's kind of a broad term, religion. Then government is becoming that I look to the government as my sustainer and protector and advocate, instead of looking to an almighty God or supreme being who we answer to. And it really, we're kind of getting into philosophy and theology here, but it really has significant ramifications for a culture and for our laws.
Absolutely. And you know what? I didn't expect to get into this as much in this episode, but I actually typed into my notes on my phone the other day as something I wanted to talk about just in general on social media and things, is the fact that we don't talk about how we see government, how we see freedom, and philosophically, like what our foundation is enough. And then this is why we have to spend so much time talking about the issues that we came on to talk about today. We have AI coming into our lives. We have all of these major overarching things that we should be focusing on, but we're focusing on little things like, do we have the right to decide if our kids need a vaccine? Do we have a right to homeschool our children? Because we don't have that philosophical foundation of what freedom means, what government should do in our lives. And because we don't focus on that at all, then we're constantly behind the 8 ball when we try to, like the AI stuff that's coming out. It's just going to keep coming and coming and coming until it's in our faces. And we haven't discussed those things because we're focused on all these little things that are impacting our daily life. So anyway, I really appreciate the conversation that we're having. I think it's very important.
I I'm glad you've done that, and you're right. And Cecily and Rita, I just have to give you a huge amount of credit here. If we were having this discussion now when the Make Homeschool Safe Act has been introduced in a state, and we've got 30 days in a legislative session to try and educate people and defeat it, we would lose. And so you and you reaching out and saying we want to have a talk about this model bill and educate people. Thank you for what you're doing. This is what Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about civil society, of educating people, because so often we're in the day in, day out grind of raising our children and making a living and working in the home or working outside of the home or wherever. And we don't have the time to think about these things. And so I really am, just from the bottom of my heart, thank you for digging into these broad philosophical issues to educate the populace, not just in the United States, in Canada and in other places as well, because these are incredibly important issues, and they really affect just a broad range of almost everything that touches us in our daily life.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's a few things coming with the new administration, potentially the new presidential administration, executive administration. And I want to talk
Canada,
about that.
I think, is getting a new prime minister as well, Cecily. I saw that.
Let's just hope. So I just got to talk about this for 1 second, because this just happened today. And guys, the day we're recording, Justin Trudeau has resigned. But he's staying on.
I had not seen that. I heard he was expected to resign.
Oh, no. Yeah, he resigned. And
you're breaking news here, Cecily.
Yeah. Well, I mean, by the time this comes out, I won't be anymore. But he's going to stay on as party leader of the Liberals and as prime minister until a new Liberal leader has been elected. And so call me a pessimist, but I'm legitimately worried. And this is, again, coming down to having these conversations before people have to make their decisions on these things, right? Because my concern as a Canadian is that there's so many Canadians who are just busy doing their thing. Justin Trudeau's gone. Who's the next Liberal leader? I'm sure they're going to be better than Justin Trudeau. Let's vote Liberal. Meanwhile, we've had a very steady Conservative leader for a long time who was going to be a shoo-in if Justin Trudeau had stayed in office until the election. So while I'm happy to see him go, I just hope people go into this with eyes wide open. Sorry, took us on a little detour there.
No, that's what I was thinking today too when I saw it, Cecily, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it. But I was like, oh, this might actually not be great for the election. So anyway.
It could not be. We'll see. Where were we going before that? I'm so sorry.
No, I was gonna...
the new administration in Washington, D.C. The Trump administration coming in.
So there were some things that came out potentially. Okay, I'll just read what straight from the horse's mouth is what I always say. This is the best way to get your information. Okay. Agenda 47 addresses on the website, Trump, quote, pledged to allow homeschool parents to use 529 education savings accounts to spend up to $10,000 a year per child, completely tax-free to spend on costs associated with homeschool education. Further, he wanted to, quote, work to ensure that every homeschool family is entitled to full access to the benefits available to non-homeschooled students, including participation in athletic programs, clubs, after-school activities, educational trips, and more. And for me, like, my kids aren't allowed to participate in the sports at our local public school. It's a school-by-school thing. We live in the middle of nowhere, so that really eliminates sports. For the most part, for my kids, there are some places they can participate in summer things. And, you know, they can do basketball somewhere and volleyball, but they don't have access to softball at school and things. So that, like, for me, I'm kind of like, oh, that sounds great. But at the same time, the federal government, this is just me saying what I think, but I want to hear what you think, because you know more about this, having worked in the federal government and with homeschooling for so long. But I'm like, the federal government really doesn't have a lot to say on the homeschool front. Right now, they don't have a lot to say about what I'm doing in Illinois with my homeschool family. But once we allow the federal government to start granting us privileges, they also then have the right to legislate against homeschooling in some instances. So I feel like it could be opening a door that I don't want opened. That's my initial take.
Yeah. So Rita, that's a great point. And I don't actually disagree with you. So, for background, here at Homeschool Legal Defense, we're very skeptical of government funds going to homeschoolers. And there's two really seminal pieces I'd recommend to you, and both you can just type it. You can Google them or type them in your search bar. The first one is called Civic Virtue, the Civic Virtue of Private Education. The Civic Virtue of Private Education. It's by the president of HSLDA, Jim Mason. I think it came out in 2017. And it's a long form article about the beauty of private homeschooling. And how that changes when, and it was written when the education savings accounts, ESAs, were really being pushed in the states. Again, this is a state issue, not anything coming from the federal government. So I recommend Google and read Civic Virtue of Private Education by Jim Mason. The second one is much shorter, a little bit easier to read. It's called Spillin' the Tea on ESA, and it's spillin' as in not spilling. So with the apostrophe there. So Spillin' the Tea on ESA. It's one we just wrote and kind of is more bullet points of what Jim had in the longer form article. And both of those really spell out HSLDA's position on ESAs and government funds. Now, having said that, we're also very big supporters at HSLDA of tax credits and tax deductions. And, in the quick 10,000-foot approach is an ESA is money that has come in through tax dollars into the treasury of a state or federal government and then given to the homeschoolers. A tax credit or tax deduction, think of the child tax credit or mortgage interest tax deduction, is something of you get to keep more of your money and it doesn't go to the government. And not only are they philosophically different, but the courts in the United States have also drawn distinctions between the two. There's a difference between a tax credit or a tax deduction or even a 501c3 status, which protects you from income tax and income taxation, and an ESA or a voucher or money that comes from the government. Significantly less strings. In fact, really the only strings with a tax credit or tax deduction are you have to use them for the intended purpose. And if you lie in your taxes, well, the IRS is going to come after you. So don't lie in your taxes, sort of thing. And you could be audited, so you need to keep records. The good news is right now, all of the legislative proposals that we've seen, and it appears what President-elect Trump is talking about, is in the latter category. So the tax credits, tax deductions. 529s are a very robust program. There's also a program called the Coverdell Education Savings Accounts, but it's a lot older, and so less people use it. 529s are very robust state and federal tax advantaged accounts of where you can put the money in, get a significant tax savings, reduce your tax liability, and then use the money for qualified education expenses. Right now, well, I should say they used to always be for higher education. I was heavily involved in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was the big tax bill that then President Trump advanced. And there was what it did was expanded 529s to also include private school tuition. The problem, though, is it's very narrowly defined as private school tuition. Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, we had worked closely with him to really do what President-elect Trump is calling for now, to expand it to also homeschool expenses. That passed the Senate, and then there was a parliamentarian maneuver. Really, to get in the weeds, I could talk for an hour about this. Rita, I told you that before we started. They had to use reconciliation to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What that allows is in the Senate in the United States, there's a much lower threshold for votes using reconciliation. You only need a simple majority, 50+1. Under Senate rules, the filibuster. Otherwise, you need to have 60 votes to end debate. And in today's divided government, I think the Republicans have 53 Senate seats right now. You're not going to get 60 votes. But reconciliation is limited because it can only be an issue related to the deficit or tax policy. And so the Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont challenged the homeschool language that we had put in, that Ted Cruz put in, and said, wait a minute, this is not related to deficit or tax policy. Ted Cruz did a masterful job advocating for it and saying, no, it is related to tax policy. But the Senate parliamentarian agreed with Senator Bernie Sanders and struck it from the final Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That happened, I think, 2 days before Christmas in 2017. I'm still salty about it. And so as a result, the language that President-elect Trump is calling for now to broaden 529s to include K through 12 homeschool expenses was struck out of the bill. I don't know how we're going to avoid having this issue if the Senate parliamentarian or Bernie Sanders challenges it again. We're actually having discussions with them. But the good news is right now the proposals that we've seen from President-elect Trump are all still related to the tax policy. And I would just say it's optional. You don't have to have a 529. Frankly, I'm not sure, and I'm not a tax lawyer, so I always caveat this with saying talk to your tax preparer, talk to a tax lawyer. Even if it was expanded, I'm not sure you'd want to use your 529 plan for K through 12 homeschool expenses, because then you're not going to have it for higher education.
Yeah.
So even if it went through, it probably would be a limited number of families who would benefit. The only ones off the top of my head, and again, as I say, as a non-tax lawyer, who would benefit are extremely wealthy families where the grandparents and the aunts and uncles are all throwing money into a 529 plan for little Johnny who's being homeschooled. And so if you have 20 wealthy relatives maxing out on little Johnny's 529 plan, then yes, you probably would really be able to benefit of using it for K through 12 expenses. Otherwise, you probably want to save it for higher education, because it's like a 401k. The longer the money is in the account, the more it grows.
That's what I was thinking, because I was like, people would have had to be contributing to this for a long time prior. They can't just, or they could just start, but it doesn't benefit them that much other than the not being taxable income. But I don't know that it's right now federally deducted. I think the new law would make it federally deductible. I'm not sure, but it just seems like it would be more simple to say, why don't you just keep $2,000 a year and we'll not tax you?
I have told our friends in the Senate, I'm like, look, I'm glad you're wanting to help homeschoolers, but frankly, increase the child tax credit. Some advocates are saying make it refundable, which helps lower income families as well. If we increase the child tax credit, that helps everyone. Honestly, diapers are expensive. So why wait until children are school age? Let's support families. And, we're also seeing the stats of significantly lower birth rates as well, and family sizes. And that's going to hurt our country demographically later on, 20, 30 years. That's what happened in Japan. They had a roaring economy, and then nobody had kids, and, they're not a roaring economy anymore. And, even with China, the one-child policy, and they've gotten rid of it. They're actually encouraging people to have children, but culturally people aren't anymore. The one-child policy in communist China was in place for so long. In the next 50 years, China is going to be eclipsed by India. And, so long way of saying, that's Will Estrada, the foreign policy points there. But long way of saying, let's encourage people to have kids. Let's make it easier. There are other ways, maybe use the child tax credit, expand it, that might help more families as well.
Good point. Okay, so Cecily, unless you have anything else in closing, I just want to hear you maybe give people a little bit of advice on how to go about combating some of these things that aren't exactly, introduced as bills yet, but are possibly coming down the pike, how to help people know about homeschooling, advocate for homeschooling. Oh, and one other thing I want to bring up, this is totally a sidebar from the question I had from you, but I meant to bring this up in the beginning. One of the things that you had said on the video chat that I watched, I don't know why I'm having trouble coming up with that word, but the video chat that I watched was that parents who homeschool, it's an education in and of itself. And I just was like, yes.
Oh, yeah.
I just, if you don't homeschool and you're listening to this, I just wanted everybody to hear that, because I'm like, it is. I am learning so much homeschooling my kids, and history is so much fun with them. Like I'm enjoying history and government so much doing that with them. So anyway, I just thought it was a really great point.
It's the truth, and it was reminding me of my education as we're going through it with our kids.
Totally. Well, for me, honestly, it's not even reminding me of my education. I feel like I'm being educated for the first time.
Yes. It's like, this is what I missed.
It's the truth, especially in history. A lot of, many parents were public schooled, and the public schools, at least in the US, are not doing a great job of teaching history, or even just teaching it in an engaging, fun way. So
yeah, see, you were homeschooled, so that's why you're reminded of your education, and we were not homeschooled. Yes. So this is our first time. Yeah, it's funny.
Okay. So Rita, to that question, here's how I always tell people. First, educate your friends and family. We all have spheres of influence. And so as you have these conversations, even kind of going to the philosophy of, to whom do children belong? Who are you going to trust more? You as a parent or a government bureaucrat who doesn't know your child from Adam? Have these conversations with people. Again, don't be pushy over the Thanksgiving dinner, but as it comes up, you have, even if it's a small sphere of influence, every single one of us has a sphere of influence. Use it for good to educate our friends and family members and the people around us. The second one is, talk to legislators. I always encourage families, whether you're in a red state, a red safe state, or maybe a bluer state, reach out to your state legislator. Some of the big issues in our country, like guns or abortion or LGBTQ issues, those are very divisive, and people are there's not a lot of wiggle room. But homeschooling, it's a broad and diverse and growing coalition. It's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's secular, it's religious people who are doing it. And so when you reach out to a legislator and just say, hey, I wanted to reach out and say thank you for protecting homeschooling. Could my kids and I come by and just introduce ourselves for 10 minutes? Build relationships with legislators now so that when they think of homeschoolers, they won't think of just, what Coalition for Responsible Home Education might say a homeschooler is, but they think of Rita, they think of Cecily. They're like, I like them. They're doing a good job. I don't want to regulate Rita. I don't want to regulate Cecily. Let's leave homeschooling alone. So you want them to have that positive mental image. And then, if your kids are grumpy, maybe don't bring those grumpy kids, but maybe bring a couple of your kids who can have that conversation. And you get to check civics off as well for that day as well. So talk to your legislators. Don't wait until there's a problem. Build relationships with them now. Third, I always encourage people, join a homeschool group. You may never need to call for legal advice, but you are strengthening the association with people who are in your state capital. So you can join HSLDA, join a local homeschool support group, join a state homeschool support group, but build that relationship. At the very least, you're going to be on an email list and you'll know when you need to make the phone calls. And then finally, and this probably is the most important part, is you are an ambassador for homeschooling. If you're a person of faith, I always have to remember I'm an ambassador for Jesus Christ as a Christian. People know that I'm a Christian. And in the same way, people know that you're a homeschooler. It's not like it was in the 80s or 90s, but it's still you as a homeschool family, as that sphere of influence. People are like, wow, their kids are polite, or their kids know something. And you can be a really good advocate for homeschooling just by being a homeschooler. Don't have to do anything fancy. And so continue to, even in the doldrums of January and February, continue to do a good job. Don't kill yourself. Don't kill your kids, but have fun homeschooling. But, continue to remember, I'm an advocate for homeschooling as you're educating your children.
It's a great point.
Very good. All right. I appreciate this conversation. I learned a lot. I'm guessing every one of our listeners did as well. And I know our homeschooling listeners will really, really appreciate this episode. So thank you so much, Will. Can you tell people a little bit where they can find HSLDA and how they can link up if they would like?
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. So our webpage is hslda.org. You can find us on all the social medias, on X, on Facebook, on Instagram. I don't think we're on, I'm glad we're not on TikTok.
Well, it's coming away anyway, I think. So
I don't know. I don't know. So we're on Instagram, we're on X, we're on Facebook, and hslda.org as well.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecily. Thank you, Rita. Thank you for what you're doing.
What a great conversation with Will. Really enjoyed getting to know him. I feel like he's had so much great experience and really learned a lot. So we hope you guys enjoyed that as much as we did. please go ahead and leave us a review. Or if you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, you can leave comments. And I like that as well because we get to respond back to you, and that's really fun. YouTube is pretty new for us. So if you enjoy watching things on YouTube, you can find us over there. And we've enjoyed seeing like a little bit of growth over there. It's been really fun to just add these different platforms and see the different ways that we can engage with you guys. So reviews, comments, all of that is appreciated. And as always, thank you for listening. If you want to find us outside the podcast, you can find us on Instagram at Boom Clap Podcast, or individually, I'm on Instagram at Cecily.Dickey, or my website, thegracetogrow.com.
And you can find me, Rita, at RitaRogersCo.com or Rita Rogers Co on Instagram. Thanks for listening.